Thank you for the opportunity to present this paper at the 2017 conference. It focuses on the supply response implications of trade liberalization, focusing on the EU-ACP Economic Partnership Agreement, specifically case of rice in Guyana. It's probably very timely to do this in light of Guyana being the host country of this year's conference. As you would know, CARICOM sells rice to the EU under the Cotonou rice quota arrangement. Rice is of course sold globally through other producers and re-exporters via different agreements. But with the EU adopting an Agenda 2000, they are implementing more compatible WTO programs and so on. But under these, there are efforts to change what they consider as market distorting rice regimes through bilateral and multilateral channels. Just a quick background, not spending too much time here because I want to focus on the findings and so on later on to stay within the time limit. But of course, the global situation, Asia being the primary producer and exporter to the world of rice, even put together South America, Central America and so on, are still very small in the conversation. But of course, the importance of the industry to domestic economies cannot be underscored. You look at the global players, importers, exporters, CARICOM countries are nowhere involved at that level of the trade. Consumers in the world market of Guyanese rice, especially in the EU, Portugal, Netherlands and so on, the primary targets. Major importers in that market, but not necessarily of Guyanese rice, are UK, France, Germany, etc. Within CARICOM here as well, we have rice producing countries and main importers. These major importers are of course focused a lot on the consumption of parboiled rice, not necessarily white or brown rice. Guyanese rice is sold in CARICOM, the EU and other parts of the world. CARICOM is a major trading area for this rice product, not necessarily the EU being the primary destination. I said earlier the importance of the industry to domestic economies, and we could look at its contribution to GDP, its contribution to employment, its contribution to supply and foreign exchange and so on. But of course, its contribution as a social aspect cannot be underscored. The study looks at the social circumstances. It focuses on rice having a multifunctional role. And I think that multifunctional role is very important. That's how we negotiate as a region and at the country level, simply because we would want to solidify or make resilient our rural economies, making them sustainable and viable into the future. Rice has been fairly faithful to the Guyanese economy, fairly stable, around 3.25% contribution to GDP. Its production, export and consumption trends also fairly stable over time. Its contribution to agricultural GDP, 11.78% 2008, and 3.25% to overall GDP. It's fairly significant industry in Guyana. If you look at some social indicators looking at Guyana in comparison to the world, its male-female ratio averages about the same, 50-51%. But very importantly, 71.7% of the population in Guyana is considered to be rural. And of course, within rural areas is where the heart of the agriculture sector lies. Relevant research on Guyana, presented by King 2001, points to the fact that unemployed persons in rural districts often resort to agriculture as their first stop for employment. So it speaks to that multifunctional role as I described earlier. The main important markets for Guyanese rice, is not necessarily the EU. Remember in the few slides before, it showed that CARICOM is the major destination. So we have Jamaica, Venezuela, Portugal and Netherlands still starring on top, in the top few destinations for that rice. The study also makes the point that production and industry level activity is impacted by policy negotiation. That's why we have to be very clear about what informs our policies and negotiations. 1975 to 2007, the industry would have been affected by an array of changes over time, and of course, going forward. Parallel to all of those policies, we would have had advice, technical advice around industry level and sector level within Guyana and of course within CARICOM. Some of it, as I highlighted here, focused. The main overriding objective suggested was a transformation of this sector, and that should allow for productivity, output and competitiveness increases. I would highlighted competitiveness here because I want to deal with it at the end of the presentation as being even more relevant now for the case of not only rice, sugar, banana and other key agricultural exports from the region. So To look at the supply response implication, we look at the background of the Nullovian supply response modeling. It was later refined in 2004, of course, having been used in over 100 studies worldwide. The methodology was refined by Lever in 2004. The transformations of the equations and the breakdown and so on is here for those of you who are so inclined. But of course, to make the point that through the transformation, we can look at price elasticity of supply, and then we would look for the inelasticities, elasticity, and so on, and how it is that world price impacts production. So the research problem is based on the fact that changes in the EU regime has a potential impact for the Guyanese rice industry, and of course, because the exports of rice are concentrated in that market, and the study is also designed to estimate the supply response function of Guyana with relevant justified variables using the approach highlighted. So, grooming it along, the relevant variables focused on our export prices, output in the previous year and the year before that, using a sort of adaptive expectations theory inside of there. The dummy variable is a rainfall dummy, speaking to the impacts on the agriculture for excessive or limited rainfall in any particular year. The model is estimated twice, including a simple time trend, and then of course without the trend to allow for some comparison. So the results indicate a fairly good fit with a coefficient of determination approximately 70%. The critical values for testing as pertains to the Durbin-Watson test, the critical values for testing for positive autocorrelation at a 0.05 level of significance using 46 data points and 5 independent variables including the constant is 1.34 lower limit, 1.72 upper limit. So the DW test statistic worked out to be 2.03, which is above the upper limit, and therefore there is insufficient evidence to reject the null in this case. So this therefore implies the absence of positive autocorrelation. Similarly, if we look at the results, there is the absence of negative autocorrelation. The F-test is used to test for the simultaneous nullity of all regression coefficients. The p-value associated with this statistic is 0, so it allows for the rejection of the null at all the conventional levels of significance. This implies simply that all estimated coefficients are not simultaneously insignificant and that the overall regression is in fact significant. If you look at the relevant justified variables a little closely, export price, 1 year lag export price has a positive coefficient and thus satisfying the a priori expectation of a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied as associated with classical supply function theory. But contrary to the assumption of adapted expectations economic behavior, which is the heart of the Nullovian model, the previous year's export price as a predictor of current year output is insignificant. So this suggests that rice production is not dependent on prices that prevail in the market, thus indicating some degree of inelasticity in supply, since farmers seem to be dependent on rice production for economic subsistence and are not market driven. The rough rice output, it was hypothesized that the previous year's output and the year before that positively influences current production. The regression estimates indicate that these are significant predictors of current output, since the associated p-values are close to 0. If you look at the rainfall dummy, the dummy is negative, however the p-value is relatively high, thus providing insufficient evidence to reject the null of the coefficient being insignificant. Therefore, while evidence suggests that weather can adversely affect agricultural output, this relationship is not statistically significant in this case. Price elasticity of supply, short and long run values indicate the relative inelasticity of the supply function of Guyanese rice farmers, implying that quantity produced is relatively unresponsive to price. So while both elasticities are within this inelastic range, of course, the differences could be attributable to some factors. The long run price elasticity of supply, the short run, being relatively fixed, such as capital and so on. In long term, you might have greater factor mobility, but these are all characteristics of crop supply elasticities. If you look at the supply response, including the time trend, the results are fairly similar and consistent with what was just presented. However, the introduction of the time trend causes the 1 year lagged export price and the 2 year lagged output predictors to become increasingly insignificant. since the associated p-values respectively 0.98, 0.55, and therefore further expels the hypothesis of prices having a significant influence on rice output in Guyana. But just for reporting purposes, the elasticities associated with the inclusion of the time trend were more inelastic than those with the exclusion. Again, these values attest to the relative inelasticity of the Guyanese rice supply function. So, in conclusion, the study would have developed an adapted Nolovian supply response model for rice in Guyana. It demonstrates the link between rice output and relevant impact variables, and this model, I believe, can be updated as a continuous monitoring mechanism for the industry in Guyana. The findings of the model suggested that rough rice output in Guyana prior to the EPA agreement did not significantly depend on export price, probably as a direct result of the non-reciprocal trade preferences to EU that Guyana enjoyed under the Lomé Convention. Rice producers in Guyana were allowed to become inefficient in the presence of secure output markets, much like monopolists. However, this behavior will now have to be revisited since the EPA introduces the liberalization of markets, which would force producers to become more efficient and otherwise competitive. The Nolovian estimation of rice supply response in Guyana points to interesting conclusions. It probably confirms why they were hesitant to sign on the deadline, which was October 1st, 2008. A failure to that signing would have resulted in higher entry tariffs and so on into the EU, and of course making them even more competitive. We propose in the study alternatives for dealing with this loss of preferences in the EU, and of course there were some policy recommendations. Among those were the use of market forces to guide production and investment activity. We saw that there was a link between previous year's production, not necessarily the export price. So a transparent EPA which gives equal opportunity and reciprocal market access may not only help ACP countries strive to become lean and competitive in production, but may also remove inefficient and less diverse players altogether. So from the results, it appears that Guyana's rice industry is not market oriented, as I said. It is recommended that policymakers observe cost of production and use market price as a guiding factor. So you can target intra-regional markets, develop export markets extra-regionally. Different suggestions, invest in research and development and so on. But of course, a targeted set of objectives for the sector, looking at competitiveness, which was point number 6, and which is what I highlighted earlier. Guyana should invest in research and development at this stage to further improve competitiveness. But of course, if CARICOM loses preferential markets and is required to trade its rice in a liberalized environment, its performance will depend on this competitiveness. So CARICOM producers must be competitive against its global partners or competitors, not only in extra-regional markets, but also in intra-regional markets, since we are import-dependent here for food. Accordingly, attaining competitiveness requires efficiency relative to global partners with respect to operations in primary production, value-added, and marketing. You look at setting specific objectives, setting guidelines, so on within the sectors. We can, various research already looked at or suggested a look at alternative EPAs and even alternatives to EPAs, and suggested that one size cannot fit all in terms of guiding the way forward for trade and national development. But speaking to competitiveness, competitive analysis is needed post-EPA with the aim of identifying commodities which are competitive in both local and export markets, and those with the potential to become competitive in the long term. We need to, of course, focus on evaluating the effect of policy changes on the competitiveness of commodities, of activities, of industries in the region. And of course, it is important as well for Guyana to assess competition, existing and potential in regional and international rice markets in an effort to gain and maintain market share. So, in terms of competitive analysis, this opens the air for future research, focus on the rice industry, the wider CARICOM agricultural sector, and of course, I thank you for the opportunity and this short time to share this research with you.